Good morning, BookTube. It's Tony here from Locks to Reads. I hope you're all doing very well. My nose is very red here, I noticed, but that's because I wear a CPAP mask when I'm asleep, and it seems to be rubbing on my nose. I just noticed that it's very clown-like today, so I hope that's entertaining for you. Today's video is I was going to do a sort of top 10 First World War books, but then I realised that it was going to be more than 10. So what I've done is these are the sort of books that I would recommend people to read based on my own reading. Now, there are thousands of books about World War One that I haven't read, and this doesn't include memoirs, which I'm going to talk about, and fiction, which I'm going to talk about in a separate video. Again, as with all these things, most of these I own on Kindle or have got out of the library, so the only hard copy ones I've got are a couple, which I'm going to talk about now. What I've sort of done is divide them into topics and then sort of generalities. So what I'm going to do is first of all is talk about a general history of World War One, and my recommendation for that is the First World War by Martin Gilbert. This might not be the best one. There are lots of generalised histories of the whole of World War One, focusing on military and politics, different things. But I like this one because it's basically a very simple, straightforward read, narrative history. And if there's bits of it that you find fascinating or interesting, you can focus on those and go and read up on more on them. There's some illustrations throughout, which is good. There is no, I don't think there's any notes or further reading list, annoyingly, but you can get out of it quite. Basically, if you want to know the basics about World War One, this is a good place to start. And alongside that, I would also recommend the First World War in 100 Objects by Gary Sheffield. There's a series of these for different sort of historical events, and obviously they sort of take an object and talk about it and contextualise it and fit it into how the war developed. And it's not just the obvious things. There are other things as well. But I found it really interesting, and it's a good. As I said, if you read both of these, I think you'd have a good basic understanding of World War One. And then, as I said, you can use these as foundations to build your reading on. Next, I'm going to talk about how the war started, or the early parts of the war. My recommendations there, well, the classic, I suppose, or perhaps the best known one, is Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August, which was published in 1962, which looks at the first month of the war, sort of from a military point of view. So it starts with plans, then the outbreak, and then the battles themselves. It's very good, very well readable. Barbara Tuchman writes very well, and there's a number of her books that I keep meaning to read. She wrote one on the Zimmerman telegram, which is something in World War One that's quite interesting in terms of dragging America into the war. But they also in and around 2013-14, obviously with the 100th anniversary of World War One coming up, a number of books were published on the start of World War One. Max Hastings wrote Catastrophe, Europe Goes to War 1914. Max Hastings is a very good military historian and a very, very good writer. I have some issues with his World War II stuff because I think he sort of has that weird fetishization of the German army that some historians have. But the first is Catastrophe is a very good read. Margaret MacMillan wrote The War That Ended Peace. That came out in 2013 as well. Sean McMeekin wrote July 1914, again 2013, and Christopher Clark wrote The Sleepwalkers, How Europe Went to War in 1914. That came out in 2012, but as you can see, they were obviously building up to the 100th anniversary. Christopher Clark is, by the way, is a really good historian. He's really detailed. It's not always the easiest to read, but it is always fascinating. He's very good at kind of really focusing on the primary sources, quotes from and extracts from diaries, from letters, etc. He's written a book about the 1848 revolutions, which I'd really like to read. I've read the first long section, and I need to crack on from there. So that's sort of starting the war. I'd say start with Barbara Tuchman because it's the is the kind of well known one. But any of those four books, I'd say the Sleepwalkers is probably the one that might be the hardest to read. Margaret Millen's is a good writer. I'm going to talk about another book of hers towards the end, and then more general sort of books about the Western Front. I'm going to recommend Nick Lloyd. Nick Lloyd's going to come up a lot. I've become a big fan of Nick Lloyd. He's writing a trilogy of books about the military in World War One, and there's the Western Front, which came out in 2021, the Eastern Front, which came out in 2024, and there's a third book that's going to come out probably in 2027 called The Wider War. As their titles give away what they are, but the Western Front book is really good, partly because Lloyd focuses as much on if not more, on the French than the British. There are so many books about the Western Front from the British point of view. I could have mentioned hundreds, and most of them I've not read. But I found the Western Front gets that good balance of military history, general narrative history, and sort of personal history. I think sometimes military history is quite confusing to read because you get some of these passages like, battalions, the 13th battalion of the 25th, and it's all numbers and letters and Roman numerals, and you're like, I don't understand any of this, even with maps. But Nick Lloyd does a very good job of making it all clear and make sense, and tie in with the what's going on in the background. The Eastern Front is really good. There's not a lot of books on the Eastern Front as a whole in the that I can think of. The only other one I can think of is Norman Stone's The Eastern Front from 1975, which I think for a long time was the only book on the Eastern Front in English. I'm sure there are loads in Russian and German, but this because the Eastern Front in World War One, from an Anglo point of view, often gets overlooked because obviously the Eastern Front in the Second World War is a much more, I was about to say spectacular, but that's exactly the wrong word. Much more immense event. And the Western Front is much more significant for us in the First World War in terms of casualties and cultural impact. So I think that's why this Eastern Front. So it's Nick Lloyd's book is actually, I would really recommend it on if you want to know about the Eastern Front. Now I'm also going to pick one book about the Somme. There are lots of books again in England. There are lots of books about the Somme. I'm going to pick one an early one, which is Martin Middlebrook's The First Day on the Somme from 1971. I actually only got around to reading this fairly recently, but I was really impressed with how it contextualises it sort of how it builds up to the actual start of the day and then takes you through the day and then the sort of aftermath, and it really contextualises why the fight was where it was, why it was organised how it was, why it went so badly, and in some cases where it went well, and the lessons that they should have learned from it. And I really recommend it. I don't think Martin Middlebrook was even a professional historian, but it's a very good book, and is very easy to read. Next, I'm going to recommend a cultural history book, which is The Great War and Modern Memory by Paul Fussell from 1975. Now, there are issues with this book. I don't always agree with it in some respects, and other people don't. But that's basically it's a literary history, a literary critical history of World War One. Someone, I can't remember who, described it as great literary criticism and lousy history. I think it's worth reading because it's kind of a foundational text for that kind of history about World War One. And later reading, you might find yourself coming to disagree with some of the things, and you might feel that he had a theory that he wanted to push that doesn't, and that the evidence he selected fitted that theory more than some evidence didn't. But it's a fascinating read, and as I said, it does sort of help you as a foundational document to introduce you to some of the sort of literary criticism about the writing of World War One, from an again Anglo point of view, British point of view mainly. Next, I'm going to talk about some medical books. My number one recommendation is The Facemaker by Lindsey Fizharris. One surgeon's battle to mend the disfigured soldiers of World War One. This is an amazing book. The subtitle is kind of a bit wrong in my opinion, because it's not. Although Harold Gillis who is the man that was the pioneer, or one of the pioneers of the plastic surgery during World War One. It's also about the people that came before him. It's almost like a history of plastic surgery. The people that came before him, the techniques that they developed, how the techniques were improved upon and refined during World War One. The team at the hospital. They actually set up a hospital in Sidcup that was the first specialist hospital for facial reconstruction. Although I think they did other body part reconstructions as well there, from what I remember of the book. And Gillies actually went on to be a sort of pioneer of surgery for trans people. And I think some of that was reflected from the lessons that he learnt in World War One. It's a brilliant book. It's a hard book to read, but I found it both very moving and very interesting. And Fizharris writes beautifully. I can't recommend it enough. Connected to that, there's Wounded from Battlefield to Blighty, 1914 to 1918, and I've stupidly not written down the author's name here. I will put it in the notes. That kind of covers. Again, that uses primary sources, so letters, diaries, etc., to sort of tell the story of how the wounded were dealt with in World War One. Again, very British Anglo-centric, from stretcher bearers through to hospitals. It's a really good book, well recommended. And finally, Break Down: The Crisis of Shell Shock on the Somme, 1916. Again, I didn't write the author's name down. I'm getting very bad at this, but anyway, that's another great book. That focuses on how shell shock began to become identified in 1915, the consequences of a sort of epidemic of shell shock after the first days of the Somme in 1916, how the British Army tried to deal with it, both badly and well, and the lessons that they gradually learned, and how the treatments for it changed over time. It's a really, again, it's one of those books where you kind of read it and you think, how did people not see this was going to be a problem, and then why did they deal with it, take so long to deal with it in a sensible manner? But yeah, it's a fascinating read. For those three medical books, I think if you read those three books, you'd have a good idea of the sort of medical medicine issues around World War One. There is another book, the title of which I can't remember, which has just come out, that I'd really like to read, which is a history of a specific history of medicine in World War One. I will try and dig out the title and put it in the notes. Then for the end of the war, I would recommend Nick Lloyd again, 100 Days at the End of the Great War, which is the last 100 days of the war, how the German offensive petered out and the Allied response to it, and the gradual rolling series of Allied victories, the change of tactics that meant that the Allied attacks were more successful while the German army was crumbling for various reasons, and how the war finally came to an end. There is a book by David Stevenson called With Our Backs to the Wall, Victory and Defeat in 1918, which I would also recommend as a sort of parallel book. But again, I love Nick Lloyd's writing is so good. I can't not recommend that book, first of all. And finally, The End of the War and the Consequences of the War. I'm going to recommend three books. Peacemakers, The Peace Conference of 1919 and Its Attempt to End War, by Margaret MacMillan, published in 2001. That's about the Versailles Treaty, the lead up to the end of the war, the Versailles Treaty, discussions around the Versailles Treaty and the treaty itself and the responses. It's very detailed, very in depth, and it's very good on covering all the different, both the Allies and the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, and who was upset by it, who gained from it, what people were trying to get out of it, why it became what it was. It's a very interesting book. I recommend that. Then The Vanquished, why the First World War failed to end 1917 to 1923 by Robert Gerworth. That's great. That's a book that takes from saw the Russian Revolution through to I can't remember what the ending is. Why it ends in 1923. I think it's something to do with Turkey. Yeah, I think it's Turkey, and the end of British occupation of the area around Istanbul. But there is a. It's very good on the problems that resulted from the ending of World War One, the ongoing fights in various places of the Russian Revolution, the situations in the Ottoman Empire as it fell apart, the situation in the Austro-Hungarian Empire as it fell apart, civil wars, revolutions, most of which failed apart from the Russian one. It's really fascinating. It's a really good, and it just shows that wars, that glibly saying wars start on one date and end on another, is not always the truth. The same goes for World War Two. Does World War Two really start in 1939, or does it start in 1937 when the Japanese invade in Manchuria, or does it start? These dates are very sort of fixed in our heads, but and obviously from an American point of view, World War Two doesn't start till 1941. So yeah, and from a Russian point of view, so it's kind of interesting to see the sort of rolling consequences of World War. Tied into which is A Nasty Little War by Anna Reid, the West's fight to reverse the Russian Revolution from 2023. That's good. Or that's about basically when the Russian Revolution happened. The Allies, mainly the British, the French, and loosely the Americans, who weren't very happy about it but did send some troops, occupied various parts of Russia in an attempt to stop the Bolsheviks from succeeding in the revolution. They backed various anti-Bolshevik leaders who were, to one degree or another, either incompetent or thugs, fundamentally. How that was a catastrophe in many ways, most ways, and how it all finally crumbled after a short period of occupation. It's very good. It's a very good book. It's a very depressing book about, I suppose, thinking through trying to do something on the cheap and on the sly, rather than doing it on a large scale. They tried to stop the Bolshevik Revolution basically with a handful of men, and the hope that a lot of money, and the hope that a bunch of very bad people would turn out to be quite good. I mean, it does look at one point like the Bolsheviks are going to get knocked back, but in the end, it doesn't work. And I suppose you can retrospectively think, well, if maybe if it had blah blah, but these things don't happen. Alternative histories or back histories are often a recipe for sort of wishful thinking in many respects. But anyway, those are my recommendations. I feel I garbled through that a bit, for which I apologise. I will put all the books and recommendations with their actual authors' names in the show notes below. I keep saying show notes; it just sounds so naff, but it'll do for now because you all know what I mean when I say that. There is not much left of November. There are 6 days, including today. I'm going to try and get a couple more videos out before the end. The one that I'm very keen to do is the memoir and fiction one. I will make that a recommendations list. There's a lot of recommendations though, but I also want to mention some of the books that you don't often hear about, because you always hear about like Goodbye to All That, but you never hear about Up to Mehmet's and Beyond, or but anyway, I'm waffling now. So that's it. That's my recommended books for World War One. I've tried to keep them to different categories. I've tried to keep the descriptions and discussions about them short. If you've got any recommendations of your own, put them in the comments below. I suppose I should say at this point to say, if you enjoyed this video, like it, subscribe if you like what I'm doing, which will improve, I promise. And there you go. Have a good day, and I will speak to you shortly. Bye.